Okay, all right. I want to start with a verse because it has to do with what we're doing. And again, for those of you who are not used to being here, what we're doing this semester, we're taking things about sort of, I guess you'd say, the life context of people who lived during the first century when the New Testament was being written, how they lived. We've talked about what their religion was and how they performed it. We've talked about the way families were organized. We've talked about slavery. And I want to start this morning with a verse where Jesus is talking to his disciples. This is in Mark 13 and verse 9. And he says, "You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them." And what I'd like to talk about, and then we'll look at some passages that Fallon will bring, governors and kings, okay, that part of it. There's a lot more about governors and kings in the New Testament than you might think. I mean, we know some famous stories have governors and kings in them. But I don't know if I've myself ever just kind of organized and said, okay, who are the governors and who are the kings? And you have stories that you really, a lot of scholars think that some of these stories are really designed to show how Jesus' prophecy is fulfilled, that you will have to stand before governors and kings. And in particular, the story in Acts of Paul being brought to trial before Felix and Festus and Agrippa, King Agrippa, is a story of Paul being brought before governors and kings to bring witness. So it kind of fulfills this prophecy of Jesus. So I want to talk to you a few minutes about governors and about kings. First, governors. And I got some coins like I often do. And then I have a wonderful chart that I want to show you. I don't know why I lived this long and never saw this chart, but anyway, I'll share that. The Roman Empire was, of course, kept spreading, and you had an emperor now, starting with Augustus. You had somebody who was called the Caesar, the Caesar, but you had all these provinces, and each one of the provinces had a governor. A little bit like in the United States, we have a president, and then we have a Senate and House, and then we have the states with their governors. The Roman Empire was fairly similar to that. They didn't do quite the same things, but you had the Caesar, and then you had the provincial governors, and then you had the council. That's the Sanhedrin in the Jewish case. We've talked about the Sanhedrin before. And there were two kinds of provinces, depending on who got the power to select who the governor was going to be. They were what they call senatorial provinces and imperial provinces. In a senatorial province, the Roman Senate got to pick who the governor would be. Nobody voted on these things, you understand. That is a little different than the way we do it. There weren't any elections. But the Senate, which was a deliberative body in Rome, could pick the governors of certain provinces. And the emperor, Caesar, could pick the governor in certain other cases. So there were those two kinds. And but however way they were selected, the governor, now in those days, they didn't think too much of government being there to serve you, okay? This is a sort of modern idea that the government is there to serve you. You're sort of there to serve it. And so the governor he was the judge. He judged in cases like a court judge, as the Supreme Court might do now. He had the personal power to do that. And many of the stories about governors in the New Testament is at a trial. It's they're making a judgment about something. So they could do that, but they also were the head of the military. They could command troops they could even start little local wars. They had the authority to have the troops to do things. And you'll see some stories like that in the New Testament. And then they sort of oversaw being sure that everybody paid their taxes. So you can see that those three things are not necessarily things that are designed to help the populace. They're mainly things for the government to keep things in order and to get as much tax money as they can. Now, there are three governors that we know by name that are very significant in the New Testament. One in particular that everybody would know, and the others that takes a little bit more biblical knowledge. And those are Pontius Pilate and Felix and Festus. And all three of, and we know, by the way, the names of all of the governors of Judea during the New Testament period. We just won't talk about all of them. These are the three that are mentioned in the Bible and that we know about. And particularly everybody knows Pilate, of course. And they appear as judges, they appear commanding troops, they do all the things that governors do, and they all held exactly the same office. Though Pilate comes quite a bit before the other two chronologically, okay? He's already long gone by the time we get to Paul and Felix and Festus. You know, one of my favorite ways of making these people real is to try to hold something in your hand that comes from their time. So in my pocket, I have, did I say that kind of right? You can tell it was actually an attempt at French, okay. Anyway, I have brought this coin minted by Pontius Pilate. So you can hold in your hand this morning something. I won't guarantee that Pontius Pilate ever held it in his hand, but it was being circulated as money in the time when Pilate was the governor. And Ken, can you mind to start that? Now, the last person has to cannot leave the room until I get my coin back.
It's already disappeared.
You got another one?
I don't know if you get if it gives you the same thrill it does to me, but all of a sudden say, this is a coin from Pontius Pilate that he minted. It does not have his name on it because the governors were not allowed to put their names on coins. They had to put the name of the emperor. So now let's look at this first picture. This same coin blown up in a picture thanks to our wonderful camera over in the library. And in Greek letters around this coin, first there's a thing that I admit to you, it looks a little like a commode. I'm sorry to mention that because it never does look like anything else. What it actually is a kind of a skillet placed on an altar, kind of like a campfire thing you take on a camping trip, and you put a skillet to fry your eggs. That's sort of a skillet put on the thing. That's to make sacrifices. It's an altar, but it's a pagan altar. All right, Pilate. Now, the Jews did not like to have pictures of people on there because they thought that was idolatry. So they didn't like coins that had pictures of people. And Pilate would honor that, but then just to get them, he put symbols on that weren't people, but they represented pagan worship. So this is a little pagan altar. I won't go through all these coins, don't have time. It says on there, Tiberius, starting in the lower left, Tiberiou, Tiberiu, of Tiberius. And then around the other side, it says Caesarou, of Tiberius the Caesar, or the emperor. Meaning he's the one that authorized this coin being made. On the other side, by the way, it says Julia the empress. So it has both the names of the emperor and of his wife, the empress. I just can't take time to explain everything on the coins, but anyway, that's what that is. And there's Pontius Pilate. Now, Felix and Festus are both famous because of the trial held before them in Acts, where Paul was brought before them for trial. And the next coin, by now we have a different emperor. The emperor is Nero now. And on this coin, this is a very common coin. It's not a rare coin. People find these kind of like in their gardens and things in Israel, even to this day. I do want to show you on one side, they're just some letters. They look all kind of scattered around. And had we the time, I'd go through all of this, but it's just interesting. These are Greek letters. Up at the top, there's an N. I think you may be able to see that there's an N. And then there's the thing that looks like a C, but it really has a little mark in the middle of it. It's really an E, a curve with a mark there. So NE, and then this thing looks like a P. Well, in the Greek that was in the first century, that's an R. They didn't have that little mark down that we have. It makes it an R to us. So we've got NER. Is that sounding like it might be something? And then in the second row, you have looks like a W. Well, that was what in the first century, that was an O. Okay, so you got NERO. And you can see what it says. What it does, it says Neronos. This is of Nero. This is a coin of Nero. And then on the other side, starting down at the lower left-hand corner, it has an L. But that's a symbol on ancient coins for year, the year. And then it has an E, one of those things with a C with a little mark in it, an E. So you know how you count in Greek, alpha, beta, I'm missing something, delta, iota, and so on. So it's the year, this one says, I think the year 5 or the year 6. So, and then it says Kaiseros. So the 6th of the year that Nero had been the emperor. So it's a little coin with a little strange things on it, but it tells you a lot. It tells you when it was minted and who minted it and all those things. And that coin would have been in circulation during Paul's ministry. I didn't bring one of them. I have a beautiful example of that you can read all the letters on it. Now, when Paul goes before Felix, the governor, there are other people there. There is Felix's second wife. There are almost always these Roman governors and so on have multiple wives, usually consecutively, but sometimes all at the same time. I'll come back to that shortly. But Felix's second wife was actually Drusilla, who was the daughter of the grandson of Herod the Great. I'm going to show you this wonderful chart. Don't worry if that's not making immediate sense. Felix married into the Herodian family. He was a son-in-law in the Herodian family. So when Paul goes before Agrippa and Bernice and Felix and Drusilla, these people are all kin to each other. Okay, that he's being tried before. They have relationships with each other. Come back to that shortly. And Felix is an interesting guy. He was sort of the black sheep of the family. His brother, Pallas, was the Secretary of the Treasury in Rome of the whole Roman Empire. A very important man. And he has this younger brother, Felix, who can't quite keep a job. And so he uses his influence to get Felix made the governor of Judea. And he was terrible. He was arbitrary. He was cruel. Finally, he got fired. Finally, the Roman emperor fired him, brought him back. He didn't come to any good end, but that's Felix. And Felix, it says in the book of Acts that Felix kept Paul in prison, not because he thought he'd done anything, because he thought he could get a bribe. Mm-hmm. And that fits exactly with what we know about Felix. Well, that's enough about that. So those are the governors, and some of the governor stories I referred to, and there's some others in the New Testament. Always watch that when you see somebody's called a governor or a proconsul. That's another name for a governor. These are very interesting people, and Paul, in particular, Paul's relationship with them is very interesting. They seem to know Paul. He seems, in some cases, to even have a good relationship with them, which kind of shows you that Paul operated in the fairly upper echelons of the culture. There are other reasons for thinking that as well. We think of Paul as being, a poor tent maker, which he was, but that was his choice. He seems to have been born in the higher levels of society. Okay, so those are the governors that Jesus said you're going to have to be before governors. Now the kings. You're going to have to appear before the kings. The Romans had another system that if in the provinces that they governed directly, they had a governor, like Pilate or Felix or somebody. But they had another form where they would dominate another country and they would control who ran that country. And they would let them call themselves king. And the scholars call these people client kings. They're the king, but they are a client of the Roman government. The American empire, if I can put it that way, has not overtly like the Romans did, but we've always kind of done things the same way. Used to do it more than, we don't have quite the clout we used to have, but almost all South American countries have been ruled basically since their origin by whoever the United States wanted to be in charge. And this was true at one point in Southeast Asia. It's been true in certain African countries. And if it was not the United States appointing client kings, it would be some European country like France or Great Britain. Great Britain did that. Great Britain would keep a king in Egypt, even though everybody knew that Great Britain was ruling Egypt. And so on around. This system was carried even into modern times. So you have these client kings. Pontus on the Black Sea, Commagene in what's now Turkey, Emesa and what's now in Syria, Chalcis, which is now in Lebanon, all those countries across North Africa that we now call things like Libya and so on. Those countries had client kings, and Judea had client kings. Now, it also had governors. It depended. If the Romans had somebody they wanted to were willing to call king and make him the king, then that would be the ruler. If they lost their confidence in whoever the king was, they'd throw him out of office and they would appoint a direct governor. And can't tell all of these stories, but that's why you sometimes have governors in Judea and you sometimes have kings. Depends on who the Romans want to actually be ruling. So now I want to spend a few minutes talking about the Herodian family. It all starts with this old codger, Herod the Great. For somebody who have lived 2,000 years ago, you can go to Israel today and Herod is all over the place. I just think, how many people that lived 2,000 years ago besides Jesus are as well known and left so many signs of them? Herod's palaces are still there. Things he built are still there. You go on as a tourist to Israel, they keep saying, now this is Herod such and such, and this was built by Herod. And you think, boy, this is amazing that this man has left so many marks of himself. And do you know he was not really a Jew? And the Jewish people knew that. I mean, he claimed to be a Jew and he more or less followed the Jewish religion, or claimed that he was. It's a little bit like politicians today become amazingly religious as soon as they start running for office. And they start holding up Bibles and using the word God a lot and, things like that, which they never did before. I'd love to tell you, I have a couple of really good stories about that, but I can't do that. Anyway, the Herod, we know where he came from, and his father was an Edomite. In the Old Testament, the Edomites are not only not Jewish, they're enemies of the Jews, but they were Arab, ethnically Arabs, the Edomites. And on the other side, his mother was a Nabatean, and they were really Arab. In fact, the Nabatean language is where modern Arabic language came from. So both of his parents are really Arabs. So Herod the Great, isn't this an ironic thing? That Herod, who built the temple in Jerusalem and was the king of the Jews, was really an Arab. And as I say, the Jews knew this and never really accepted him as being a legitimate king. To them, he was more as somebody the Romans had imposed on them and not a real king. But he is the guy that is always the Herod that you read about in the stories of the baby Jesus. Let's show that other coin. I won't take a lot. This is a very interesting coin. But on one side, it has a sort of round thing. The scholars still don't know exactly what that is. Can't talk about that right now. On the other side of the coin, there's what kind of looks like a bouquet or something in the middle, and written around it in Greek letters, it says, of Herod the king. This coin was minted by Herod the king. I'd love to go through the letters all because it's all there, but it's in these Greek letters that are slightly different. The way they spelled Herod was what looks to us like HPO. It's really HRO. There's a sort of shorthand for Herod, and this says on there, of Herod the king. We have a lot of coins, a lot of different kinds of coins that have survived from Herod. But so when you read about killing the babies in Bethlehem and all those, or the three wise men coming to Herod, that's the Herod. Now, when Herod died, Herod had lots of children and lots of wives. And he had them all at the same time. Herod reminds me a lot of Henry VIII in a lot of ways. Whenever I try to picture Herod, I always get a picture of Henry VIII in my mind. Except that Herod the Great just had to kill his present wife before he could marry again. Whereas Herod just kept marrying different women. He had children by a lot of women, and the two that really should have been his heirs, he killed both of them for plotting against him and their mother. So none of his, what he intended to be his heirs, really inherited his kingdom. But four of his sons, well, really three of his sons did, and we know who the fourth one was. And they have, one of them is named Herod Archelaus, one of them is named Herod Antipas, one of them is named Herod Philip. And unfortunately for us today, when you read the Bible, the biblical writers call all of these people, they just call them Herod. So when you read a Bible story and it has Herod in it, you have to look somewhere else to figure out which one of them it is. Because all the Herods in the Bible are not the same person. And all of these I just mentioned are mentioned there, but they're all called Herod. So that's why this chart becomes wonderful. Let's look at the chart now. Oh, no. One other coin. I got one other coin. This is, again, a very common coin there. Herod's grandson was named Herod Agrippa. And Herod Agrippa is the man who killed the first of the 12 apostles to be killed, James. And Herod shows up several times in the Bible, and so he's an important person. And these little coins that are people still find today in their gardens in Israel. On one side, it has 3 shocks of wheat. I find it interesting, by the way, that for many, many years in America, our penny we call them wheat pennies. It had the shocks of wheat on them. Well, this is the ancient one, and on it has an L, which means the year. And then it has which year of, and who's the king. You turn the coin over, and it has, start down at the bottom at the left, and it has C. Well, the C's left over from the last word, but the first letter to look at is a thing that looks like a V, but it's upside down. It's an A, and then the next letter is a G, which looks like an upside down L-A-G, and the next letter is a P, which we now know is an R. So you've got A-G-R, and then you've got an I. Anyway, it's going to spell Agrippa. And it says Agrippa, and then it says Basileus on the other side, Agrippa the king. Well, this is the grandson of Herod the Great. And so that's an Agrippa. But the Agrippa that Paul comes before, Herod Agrippa, that Paul comes before, the book of Acts, is this Agrippa's son, Herod Agrippa II. And his headquarters were in Caesarea Philippi, where I excavated for years and years, and Ken with me one year. And we found his palace. It's a wonderful thing. Big stories that can't be told. But but he's sometimes just called Herod too. But fortunately, usually he's called Herod Agrippa or just Agrippa. Now let's look at this wonderful chart, and I'll do 5 minutes on it, and then I'll turn it over to Fallon. I just found this on the internet. Now, the AI thing on the internet was a total bust. Everything I found on there was wrong. But this is right, and it's wonderful. It starts with Herod the Great at the top. Can you see it? Okay. And it says here, he tried to kill Jesus. You see that little arrow goes over there. He's the one that tried to kill Jesus. Now, he has all these wives. The little red boxes are the wives that we know about. There's another little box over, boxes over there with 6 more. So he had 9 or 10 wives. But these are the ones that count. First, he had Mary Amney, whom he really truly loved, but he got mad and had her executed. True love, that's tough love, I call that. Anyway, his son was Agrippa, the Herod Agrippa, the first Agrippa. So you'll see on the chart, it shows Mary Amney, and then it's just got a little blank there because her sons, Herod killed them too. But his grandsons, Herod Agrippa the first, and Herodias was a woman, so his grandson and granddaughter are pictured there. King Herod Agrippa the first and Herodias. Now we know Herodias because she's the one that has the daughter named Salome who dances, and then her mother says, "Tell him to bring the head of John the Baptist on a platter." That's that Herodias, and she's actually the sister of King Herod Agrippa. Okay, well, let's just follow that family on down. Then King Herod Agrippa has a son. First those little arrows go down. He's the one that imprisons Peter, and he's the one that kills James, the apostle. That's Herod 1. Now he has several children that enter into the biblical story. There's his daughter Bernice. I thought, before I leave this earth, I'm going to write a book about Bernice. She's one of the most interesting women in history. Why she hasn't had a big movie made about her, I don't know. But somebody has slipped up because she's got a great story. It's got all the elements that people like when they go to the movies. So, but anyway, that's Bernice. Then Bernice's brother is King Herod Agrippa II, that Paul appears before. And if you look carefully at that story, Bernice is there. She's with King Herod Agrippa II. And the great scandal of the day was that she was having an affair with her own brother. See what I mean with the movies? I'm not sure Hollywood's even ready for that yet, but they'll be there. Give them time. But anyway, so that relationship was scandalous, and it's interesting that they're both there. They're there together to hear Paul out. And so the women in this family are very interesting. We got Herodias and the head of John the Baptist. Now we got Bernice. Anyway, then you see there's Antonius Felix, our old friend who was the Roman governor. He's married to Drusilla, and Drusilla is the sister of Herod Agrippa and of Bernice. They're all in the same family. And all appear in various ways. And then it says that he's the one that has the relationships with Paul. Felix does, as does Herod Agrippa. So that's that side of the family. Now, another wife has 2 sons named Herod Antipas and Herod Archelaus. Herod Archelaus was bad even for the Roman family. For the Roman period. He was made the king in Jerusalem, the king of Judea, when Herod the Great died. He only lasted about 5 or 6 years. He did such a poor job that the Romans kicked him out and put in a Roman governor. And that's why you have Pilate. Jesus would have been tried before Herod Archelaus, except he'd been fired, and the Romans had sent their own man Pilate in to replace him. So that's how Herod Archelaus. Herod Antipas, on the other hand, was the king up in Galilee. He was Jesus' king. In other words, Jesus was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. He's the one that Jesus is going to tell that fox. Remember that story where he calls him a fox? And Herod Antipas ruled for many, many years. He managed to keep his place. And there's a famous story during the trial of Jesus where Herod Antipas is visiting down in Jerusalem for the holidays. And he has an interview with Jesus. Go back and read that story sometime where Herod Antipas and Jesus have a discussion. Says Antipas wanted to see him do a miracle. So he had him come in to see if he'd do a miracle for him. That's Herod Antipas. He ruled up in Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, just a few miles from where Jesus lived in Capernaum. Then there was Herod Philip, who ruled in Caesarea Philippi, and Philip, I should say Philip the Tetrarch. He's on the chart here called Philip the Tetrarch. And then he had a brother whose name was also Philip. These people didn't try to make it easy for you. So Philip the Tetrarch's wife, who was Salome, had been married to Herod Philip, divorced him, and married his brother. Okay. It's another reason why I think Hollywood would love this. They'd fall right into this sort of lifestyle pattern of the Herodian family. So anyway, that's a wonderful chart because you can see how these people all relate to each other. You may not be quite as excited about it, but anyway, it helps you to get all these people figured out. And if for no other reason, it sort of helps you to know which Herod you're dealing with, or whether you're dealing with a client king, or whether you're dealing with a with a Roman governor, and how that's different. So okay. I think I've confused everything enough.
Perfect.
Well, got my coin, by the way.
Right there.
Oh, good. Not that I'm
Before John slides away, rolls away.
Yeah, when I saw somebody leave out the back, I thought, I better
Questions.
check.
Questions of clarification for John, because I can't help you.
You can't help me now.
No, I can't help them with clarifications.
You just gotta take what you got.
There you
I
go.
had a real simple question. Our coins, it seems like you handle them, and it's always the face that's rubbed bare when it's a real coin.
Right.
All of these coins are worn almost entirely around the edge. Why is it?
Yeah, well, if you just look at them by the hundreds, I'm not sure that would be the general rule. But usually ancient coins wear, kind of like ours do, that is, they wear with what's the highest point. And that inscription, in many ways, is the most important thing on their coins. And so the inscription, and that's really unfortunate, because when you try to identify an ancient coin, you need to see that inscription, and 9 times out of 10, it's worn, sometimes worn completely off. But I think that's just because when they struck the coin, the word stood out higher than the face did. Yeah. Yeah. Was there another question? Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, there's a lot we could look at, but I'm gonna hone in on 2 stories. The birth of Jesus and the death of Jesus seems fitting as we approach Easter, being in the middle of Lent, that we remember that particular time. Though I did make a few notes as John was talking and added some of the texts. So if you're curious about looking at those specific texts, I already did the work for you. So I'll just let you know, and you can just make a note of them. And if you don't care, that's totally fine. We're gonna look, so Matthew 14 is one of the stories of John the Baptist. We're gonna look at Matthew today. Of course, John the Baptist being beheaded is in multiple stories. So the conversation between Herod and Herodias and the daughter Salome, you can look at that. One option is Matthew 14. We're going to look at Matthew 2 and Matthew 27. Acts 23 is Paul in front of Felix. So if you look at Acts 23 through 24:4, Acts 23:23 to 24:4. That's Paul in front of Felix. And then Acts 26 is Paul in front of King Agrippa II and Bernice. That one's actually really short. Do you mind if I just read that one really fast? Because it's kind of interesting. That one's Acts 26, 1-3. And then at the very end, after Paul's speech, we get a glimpse of Bernice. So I won't read Paul's speech. I'll just read the story. So this is Acts 26. If you want to follow along, starting in verse 1, we're going to read 1-3 and then jump to verse 30. And this is Paul defending himself before Agrippa. So the speech in between is Paul testifying to his conversion and why he follows Jesus. Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and began to defend himself. "I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa. I am to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, because you are especially familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." Paul gives his speech about why to follow Jesus. And then verse 30, "Then the king got up, and with him the governor and Bernice and those who had been seated with them. And as they were leaving, they said to one another, 'This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment.' Agrippa said to Festus, 'This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor.'" So just a little glimpse of the relationships there and how much I think the way, like all that context that we got from John just now, and then like reading it here in Acts, how much like assumed information there is in the story, which is obvious too in the Gospels with the way that they refer to Herods, all the Herods, and they just assume, yeah, you get the timeline, like you know what we're talking about, and the rest of us are left to try and piece together, like, wait, Herod died in Matthew 2, and now Herod is beheading Jesus or beheading John the Baptist, so it's kind of confusing. All right. Let's turn our attention to Matthew 2. And as we're reading, imagine the tension. So one of the things John just shared with us was the instability of Herod's rule from the bottom. So all the people Herod oversaw knew that Herod wasn't actually Jewish, didn't actually have a right to rule over them. So from the bottom, there's kind of this anxiety about his right to rule. And then of course all of the client kings knew that they were puppets, right? Like they were puppets, and it was the Roman emperor who really had the authority to rule over those areas, and they could be kicked out, they could be removed at any time. They were completely at the will of the emperor, and so they were client kings, but they were also kind of puppet kings. So think about that as you listen to this story in Matthew 2, and think about how this would, what Herod would be experiencing during this time, and how that may have motivated Herod's actions. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star in the east and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I also may go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen in the east until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt. And remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more, When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who were seeking the child's life are dead." That's Matthew 2, verses 1 through 20. What do you notice, knowing kind of what you learned about client kings and specifically Herod the Great, which is this particular Herod that we were reading about? What stands out to you, or did you notice kind of underneath the text that maybe you hadn't noticed before? Or maybe you had, and you want to share.
Kings don't like the possibility of other kings being born that are not a part of their family.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a good observation. And yeah,
Was it assumed that the killing of the babies in Bethlehem was successful? Otherwise, didn't the threat of survival persist so that it was safe still for Christ to come back?
so that's why they had fled, was because
Right.
of the massacre of the.
But what
of
made
the-
it safe for them to come back?
Herod died.
But wouldn't the threat have persisted unless they thought the killing of the babies were successful?
I guess you mean like they thought they killed the Messiah? Yeah. So, probably that would make sense. It does go on a little bit, to say that in verses 21 and 22, this is verse 22, when Joseph heard that Archelaus was ruling Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And so that's one of the reasons why they end up in Galilee, is a fear of the king that takes Herod the Great's place.
I just think in some ways it's so ironic because we're hearing the context of history here and it's real complicated.
Mm.
So here's a non-Jew, the Messiah is coming, I'm gonna kill him because, okay. And then the Messiah really does survive,
Mm.
but then the people who the Messiah comes to, the Jews, they reject him. It's so ironic but that's the way history works.
Mm.
And John helps us see, and what are we doing today?
Yeah.
So it's a commentary.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the reasons Jesus is rejected is because he wasn't the military takeover king that they were hoping for and expecting. But
And the whole thing about killing the, trying to kill Jesus as a baby is similar to Moses' story of them trying to kill all the babies. And he escaped.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, there's a definite parallel to Pharaoh there, that Matthew is for sure trying to draw out and say like, yeah, this king is a Pharaoh king. Yeah. Herod the Great is like Pharaoh.
There's also this thing about killing children. There are literally hundreds of examples in history of children being killed because they were in line for the throne. That was one of the great difficulties. Most people have been ruled by hereditary lines through most of history. You know, all European countries had kings, and then you had to pick the heirs. And so any child, I know in the Turkish Empire, when the Sultan died, he had maybe 40 wives and he had maybe over 100 children of all ages. And they would pick which one was going to be the next Sultan. And then they killed all the rest of them. So we think of this being a horrible one-time in history story, but this has happened many times in history where the potential heirs who are just little children are eliminated. So
This is let me just share a screen so Zoom can also see this. And so in Nazareth, if you go to Nazareth, sorry, I can't multitask. If you go to Nazareth, and go to the place, it's not necessarily the place Jesus was born, but archaeologically it fits the description of where Jesus could have been born. And they have a tomb there that is full of, it's devastating, full of the skulls of babies. That I don't think, John, can you remember, I don't know if they were found there or if they have since been collected there and then put there as like they were found in various places and collected there, but it's a mass grave of of the death of the innocents, the massacre of the innocents. But yeah, it would have been something that would have been an intimidation, like a terrorist tactic from a dictator, essentially. Yeah. But yeah, it's there. So if you go into this place and it's set up as a place of worship for Jesus, a place of remembrance of Jesus' birth. There's also this area there where that like it was a rife time. Yeah. It's pretty fascinating. There are better pictures online, and for some reason they weren't popping up like they usually do. I must have been typing in something off. Yeah, Claire?
Something that stood out to me in this text was in verse 3. It says, King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. I wonder, like, since we've been talking about, the power dynamics, if like what Jerusalem in there means, how sometimes we use words to describe, like, I wonder if it's referring to like all of the people in power were also afraid, or if it's
that's how I interpret it. Yeah, because all is often used in the Bible more hyperbolically than literally. And it's not literally that all of this, obviously, all of the city of Jerusalem wasn't all terrified. They wouldn't have known about it. But yeah, like that the people in power. Do you have another?
Well, I was just gonna say, you hear the expression today, Washington is very upset about
Right.
such.
Yeah.
It's something like that.
Mm-hmm. Should we look at one more text here? Let's jump to Pontius Pilate in Matthew 27. I picked Matthew just because Matthew has Herod in the beginning, and so I picked the Matthew story for Pontius Pilate too. But of course, he appears in any of the Gospels, and you could kind of see how they portray him slightly differently. So this is Matthew 27. I'll read verses 1 to 2 and then jump to verse 11. When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, so this is immediately after Gethsemane, the morning after Gethsemane, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. So jumping to verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked Jesus, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to Jesus, "Do you hear how many things they testify against you?" But Jesus answered him not one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you? Barabbas or Jesus, who was called Christ?" For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" They said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified.
So I have a question for John. Since Pilate was sort of a substitute here, did he have to cave in more easily than?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I always think about with this sentence is, it's, to this day, whoever's in charge will do whatever they can to keep there from being a riot. For whatever purpose the riot is, it's never good for the people in charge to have the populace rioting. You can see he's caught in a political net, because one quick way to go lose your job if you were Roman governor was if you can't maintain law and order. If you've got people in the streets threatening to kill somebody, Rome is going to hear about that, and you're not long for your job. So I think that's the politics of what's going on here. You can see Pilate knows what's the right thing to do,
Right.
but he also knows what's the self-preserving thing to do, and that's the direction that he takes. By the way, in that next verse, it says, then the governor's soldiers took Jesus. So you see how he's also the military commander.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, thanks for trying that out. It's almost 10, so do we have time? Is there one more comment or question that you want to share before we have to get down? I'm always struck every time I read the Gospels by the violence that frames Jesus's life. And how messy it is. It's both religious violence and it's political violence. And like Jesus's life of peace is so extra striking given the violence that bookends his life. At least it's really striking to me every time. It's almost startling.
When I did my London first in 1988, I took a history class. And I was just amazed what I didn't know, but I didn't know anything. Okay. But it's sort of like, where did our legal system come from? And it was basically to protect the people from the king. And if you look at the history of England, this stuff was going on because they had kings in England, Henry VIII and everything.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for a law to protect the people, we're in trouble. And I think it even continues today.
That's a great insight that through most of history, laws have been designed to protect the king against the people. And it's something sort of new in human history to have laws that protect the people against the king. That's a new idea.
Yeah.
A hard one to maintain.